Welcome back. So, one of the biggest days on this channel every year is the trade deadline. And this year should be interesting because it's been quiet to this point and it could stay that way. There are a lot of teams here in the top 10. So, these are the standings according to the NHL itself. So, just went through the NHL app, put them all in order by where they are in the standings right now in the National Hockey League. So it's 1 through 32. So you got your 1 through 10 here, 11 through 21 here, 22 through 32 here, and, that's it. So Colorado leads the way, 60 games, 89 points, and there will be plenty of, well, that's the jinx. That's your President's Trophy jinx. The reality is that I think any of these top 4 teams could be seen as preemptive favorites. I think arguments can be made for Colorado, for Carolina, for Florida, as well as for Tampa. Now, Florida is the only one of the top 4 that had a coaching change. So Quenneville steps down, Brunette takes over. They had a bit of a rough patch there when they were getting used to that change behind the bench. But under Brunette, they're 33-13-6. So their overall record's excellent. Their record under Brunette's excellent as well. And Florida looks pretty darn good. So the reality that it is possible, it's not likely, but it is possible, Toronto could. They're 7 points back. It's highly unlikely. But if Toronto did end up finishing first, you could have Florida and Tampa Bay in the first round. Either way, you could have Toronto against Tampa. You could have Boston against Tampa. You have 4 of the top 10 teams in the league are in the Atlantic Division. And then you look at where we're standing with the Metro, and you have 3 teams in the Metro in the top 6, and you have 4 of the top 11 in the Metro. So if you believe that the East is stronger than the West, the standings would tell you you're correct. And then when you look at the other divisions, the Central and the Pacific, the one thing that's interesting to me is that the 16th place team is Vegas right here. And they are also the last place team in a playoff spot in the West. And every team that's outside the playoffs in the league is below that line. So that's good. So while the argument may be made of, well, it's not fair the teams in the East are playing against each other and the teams in the West have easier opponents, the reality is the top 16 out of 32 teams are in the playoffs. And there isn't really a situation that's likely where Columbus, who has 63 points right now, they're 5 points back of Vegas, where Columbus would end up with more points than all of these teams and miss a playoff spot. Because we have seen situations before where a team is in the playoffs that has less points than a team that missed the playoffs in the other conference. That's never a good situation. So right now, that's not one we have to worry about. We will see the discussion of how to make things fair. What's interesting is the 1 versus 8 argument. Obviously, then you'd have Colorado against Vegas as just an example in the first round. I don't know how Colorado would feel if Vegas was all of a sudden healthy for the playoffs and that's their opponent. I don't know if they'd feel blessed by that as the number 1 seed. But the interesting thing is, I don't think there's a way to make it so that the East looks fair, comparatively speaking, with the West, where you're going to have teams knocked out in the East in the first round, where those fan bases in the East are going to say, it sucks that my team got knocked out, because if they were in the West, they absolutely at least would have won a round. So that argument will be had, especially if we see Tampa Bay against Toronto, especially if we see the Rangers and the Penguins, which looks highly likely at this point because you've got a 6-point separation between Pittsburgh and Carolina, and Washington here with 74 points. They're 5 back of the Rangers, 7 back of the Penguins. So it's highly unlikely that they finish higher than the first wild card. To get to the first wild card, they have to pass Boston, who are currently 3 points ahead of them with a game in hand. Now, all-out sellers, I would think, for this deadline, and again, just me spitballing here, Colorado should be all-out buyers this year. All-out sellers over here. All-out buyers this year. Colorado should be in that. I don't think Carolina needs to. I don't think Carolina's in a position where they need to trade out a bunch of draft picks and bring guys in. I don't think they need it. Florida may very well end up being buyers somewhat at the deadline, and it's going to get tricky because some of these teams are going to need dollars in and dollars out, which is part of the reason that the trade deadline's been so quiet. You can't just go out and get players and go above the cap. Speaking of which, Tampa has no cap space. So Tampa might want to add. They don't have any cap space to do it right now. A bit of a tough road trip for them through Western Canada, but there's no reason to panic at this point with the Tampa Bay Lightning. Pittsburgh's an interesting team in that, they could go out in the first round again. and they could go on a run. I never bet against Crosby and Malkin. And if they're against the New York Rangers, I would lean towards Pittsburgh winning that series. Although Shesterkin could absolutely steal it. The Rangers, an up-and-coming team. No need for them to panic and go out and get a bunch of players at the deadline. I don't think they need it. Toronto definitely needs help on the blue line. They definitely could use help in goal. I don't think they're going to find it at the deadline. I don't think Korpisalo's the answer. I don't think that picking up Vejmelka would necessarily turn around Toronto's chances if, in fact, Arizona decided to move Vejmelka, which is still not a certainty, right? So for Toronto, it's going to be interesting. For Calgary, I think there's some pressure on them to win. It feels like with Johnny Gaudreau as a UFA in the offseason, odds are they probably keep him. However, with the amount of money it's going to take to keep him, it might be harder to put, the whole team together and stay in a contending position. Boston, getting a bit older. I would not be surprised if they, I don't know if going all in is the right way of putting it, but I would not be surprised if they pick up a couple of players at the deadline. Keeping in mind they're also trying to move Jake DeBrusk. St. Louis is going to be an interesting one to watch because I don't know if I see St. Louis right now as a team that's capable of going on a long run. But 2019, they were pretty darn good in the second half of the season. They end up riding that momentum to a Stanley Cup. Ville Husso's been very good this year. He absolutely could steal them a series. And then after you've won a first series, sure. And then you got Washington, who may very well feel some pressure because Ovechkin's not getting younger. And who knows how next season's going to go. So you may feel some pressure to add at the deadline and say we need to go for it now. So that's a lot of teams that may be looking to add. The problem is when I look at the market and when I look at the trade bait and all this that I keep seeing, there isn't anybody that really jumps out at me. Like I see Giroux and I think, okay, Giroux, if he goes to Colorado, that could help them. But does that really put them over the top? I don't know. And that's the thing. When you're making these deals at the deadline, you want to do what Tampa Bay did. They go out, they get Barclay Goodrow, they go out and they get Coleman, and they win the Stanley Cup. And those guys are key players to them to winning back-to-back Stanley Cups. And being able to replicate that isn't easy because while you can find those deals, you can find way more deals that are made at the deadline that are seen as this might be what puts us over the top, and then it doesn't. Boston is, for instance, the Rick Nash deal, which I liked at the time. I thought the Rick Nash deal was worth the risk. It doesn't work out in the long term. And that's the thing. Which of these teams can afford right now to give up draft picks, give up future assets to go on, go for it, running that risk of it not working out? Which, in the East, 7 out of these 8 teams are going to end up losing because that's just how it works. And there'll be questions asked of, I would think, at least half of them when the season's done. LA is an interesting one. They're 33-20-8, 74 points on 61 games, 607 points percentage. Not expected to be that good yet. Now, of course, they're dealing with a ton of injuries. I would think LA, Rob Blake's already made it clear he's not interested in selling or necessarily standing pat. I think they're going to add at the deadline. If they could make it work under the cap, that might be a good spot for Claude Giroux too. If you can make it work, and that's going to be the storyline through this trade deadline. How do you make this work under the cap? Where we can armchair GM and say, well, this guy'd fit in perfect here. Cool, yep, he'd fit in perfect. That's a second line center, that's a second line winger. This guy'd be a great top 4 defenseman, and you're $5 million over the cap, and you're $8 million over the cap. Like, that's the problem. So if LA can make it work, I would not be surprised if they're players at the deadline. Minnesota, 34-20-4 record in 58 games, 621 points percentage. So even though they're lower on the standings with 2 less points than Washington and LA, they've played 3 less games in LA and 2 less than Washington. But, and I mentioned this in a video this morning, the teams that have played less games now are facing the reality that things are going to be much, much more difficult for them down the stretch. They're going to have to play a lot more games, right? And so you're going to have more back-to-backs, and I think that increases the chances that maybe those teams end up having injury problems. Maybe it might be more difficult for them to win some games down the stretch because they have so many games left. Edmonton, 59 games, 68 points for them. Under Woodcroft, they are 9-5-1. So since the coaching change, that has helped. They got that bump. They came down a bit. Now they seem to be holding their own, I think they stay above the playoff line. Because think about it. You've got Dallas below the playoff line. Dallas is absolutely capable of picking it up and getting in there. They have a 588 points percentage, which is higher than both Edmonton and Vegas. Vegas could turn things around, but Vegas has been cold for 2 months now. Vegas has 68 points in 61 games for a 557 points percentage, and I could see them falling out. As I mentioned in the video I did this morning, they have 3 games against Vancouver next month. That could go a long way to deciding yes, they're in the playoffs or no, they're not, which could also help Vancouver, who are 3 points back of the playoffs, 1 game in hand on Vegas. But what hurts Vancouver is they're 2 points back of Dallas, who have 3 games in hand on them. Dallas might be a team to watch because with Heiskanen out long term, the speculation now that maybe Dallas holds on to Klingberg, that would make some sense. They don't have a puck-moving defenseman. If they trade Klingberg and don't have Heiskanen in the lineup, you have some really serious problems then with offense from the blue line. Although Klingberg does have his defensive mishaps. So for Dallas, they may be more likely to stand pat at the deadline. They've played really well lately. They do need to get better at protecting leads, but they may very well end up jumping into that spot occupied by Vegas. So right now, if just looking at the standings, unless Vegas suddenly heats up, yeah, they're probably the team that ends up out. They are probably the team that ends up out. They had these games against teams that are lower than them in the standings, teams that are well outside the playoffs, and they didn't win enough of them. And this is the position they find themselves in. If they had done well in those games, instead they'd be up here and we wouldn't be talking about it. For Dallas, again, we'll see if they do stand pat. Again, it would be a really ballsy move for them to trade Klingberg. It on some level, if they traded Klingberg at the deadline, it would be like when Shattenkirk gets traded at the deadline by St. Louis, where it looked like St. Louis was just giving up the hunt, and then they made it into the playoffs anyways. So if Dallas did trade Klingberg, it would be pretty gutsy. You'd kind of have to hope that it sends the right message to the rest of the team and not one of, well, we're not going to make it anyway, so we might as well just trade guys off. But yeah, it'll be interesting. Vancouver will be interesting too. They've been 21-9-5 under Boudreau. The one trick is they do need teams ahead of them to stay cold. If Edmonton and Vegas do fall back, Vancouver can jump in and take third spot in the division. That's the interesting thing too, is that at 65 points, they're 3 points back of Edmonton. Looking at the wild card picture, they're not really trying to get into the wild card. They should be looking at third place in the division and saying, all right, if we can win enough, we could get a meeting with LA in the first round. So, and no offense to LA, but I think if you have a choice between playing Calgary, Colorado, or the LA Kings in the first round, I think you want the LA Kings out of those 3 teams. Although, if we had Calgary against the Vancouver Canucks, well, that would be the most viewed series ever on this channel. Those reviews would that would be a very popular series. Those teams do not have short series for the most part. They usually have very entertaining series, usually really close. And if you're a Flames fan, good news. Usually Calgary wins that matchup. Winnipeg. So Winnipeg, I still think, is in a position where they'd be better off. I don't know if selling's the right term, but move out some assets and get some draft picks or young guys back. They're 4 points back of the playoffs. Under Dave Lowry, they're 14-13-5. So under Lowry, their record has actually been a little bit worse than it was under Maurice. Overall, they're 27-23-10 for 64 points. 533 points percentage. I don't see them as a playoff team. However, being within 4 points of a playoff spot makes it tough to just sell at the deadline. So for Winnipeg, I think they're close enough now, and because of Vegas falling off, and Vancouver's not a juggernaut. They're playing well under Boudreau. They're not a juggernaut though. And Dallas, again, having trouble protecting leads. There might be an opening there for Winnipeg. Then there's Anaheim. They've played more games than everybody else. They played 62. They're 27-25-10. They're also at 64 points, 516 points percentage. So that's taken a dive. And for Anaheim, it was expected they'd be outside the playoffs, and there's already talks about who might be available and what kind of sales they might make. I do think that Hampus Lindholm, if they trade him, I think eventually they regret that. I love Lindholm. I think he's a really good defenseman, and I would hope Anaheim figures out a way to keep him around. Even though if they trade Hampus Lindholm, obviously that would be, at least some kind of buzz around the trade deadline to get things going. Columbus, 30, 27, and 3 for 63 points on the season. They're 5 points out of playoffs in the West. The problem being they're not in the West. They're in the East. They are 11 points out of the playoffs in the East. So that's the difference between the two playoff lines. And for Columbus, they haven't really been completely in the hunt for weeks and months now. Although when Washington was having a real struggle before that road trip of theirs, it looked like Columbus might make things interesting. And then it just doesn't work out that way. And then you get over here. And on this side of the board, I think you're into basically where the selling takes place. Columbus has made it clear they want to keep Laine, so they're not selling off Laine at the deadline. There may be some players who get sold, but again, there aren't that many really blue chip names that are out there. I mean, you've got Giroux, but every time I hear like Sherratt for a first rounder, I like Ben Sherratt. I've been a fan of his since he was in Winnipeg. I've thought Ben Sherratt, and the funny thing is I wasn't a fan of his until I started watching all the games, and then I became a fan of Sherratt. I don't think he's had a great year. I think he's had a good run under St. Louis, where they're 8-5-1 under Marty St. Louis right now. But I don't know that I'd give up a first-round pick. Even if I'm one of these top teams here, I think a first-round pick for Sherratt, probably a little bit high. A second-rounder, sure. A late second-round pick, sure. But that first-round pick, I'm not sure if I would pull the trigger on that as a general manager. It could still happen. We do see players get traded for first-round picks regularly who we look at and say, I'm not sure about that. And Tampa Bay being a good example. When they traded one for Gaudreau and they traded one for Coleman, I thought there was definitely some risk to that. It ended up being okay. They won the Stanley Cup. I think they were happy about the return. Chicago's interesting. They're 21-21-6 under King as the coach. So King, I think, is coached well enough that he probably sticks around after this season. Mike Yeo, I would think, does not. Under Mike Yeo, they are 10-20-7. So as rough as things were under Alain Vigneault, they have not gotten better under Mike Yeo. I think that you end up seeing him out as coach. Claude Giroux is an interesting one, too, because they haven't... I mean, there's been a lot of talk about Giroux. I'm talking about him here. I've talked about him a couple of times already. But until Philadelphia decides to actually trade him, which... I mean, they'd have to go to him and talk to him, and there'd have to be a process there. I haven't heard that process has necessarily got started yet. So, I mean, it still could, right? While I'm making a video this morning, Matthews gets suspended, so that can be a thing. But, well, I'm talking about how much I think he gets, and then he gets it. So, I'm on the fence with Giroux about whether or not I think trading him makes sense for Philadelphia. I don't think Philadelphia is nearly as bad as their record. I think some kind of a sell is okay, but I agree with people that think that Ristolainen's contract is an eyebrow raiser. In terms of both the cap hit and the term of the contract, I think that's a real eyebrow raiser. It's one of those ones where if a general manager says to me, hey, I'm going to sign this guy for this long, my answer would be, sure. You think that's... no judgment here. Are you sure? But you haven't put pen to paper yet. Just think about this first. Oh, yeah, no, you signed it. All right, good luck. So, clearly in Philadelphia, they see themselves as being close to a return next year. They've talked about how they believe that they're going to be able to come back next year and compete for a playoff spot. Whereas in Chicago, of course, they've talked about, rebuild. And the rebuild word means that anybody could end up being on the list of potentially being sold except for your untouchables. And I still think Patrick Kane's an untouchable. While I hear... every now and I really think sometimes it's about, getting those clicks. I don't think that's the prime driver behind some in the media mentioning names that get mentioned. But when I hear Patrick Kane, I kind of just shake my head and say Chicago wouldn't do that. I understand the $10.5 million cap hit. I understand that contract's up at the end of next season. I don't think he asks for a raise over the $10.5 million. I mean, they could move Taves, but again, they'd have to retain at least some of that salary, and then there's the Y aspect. So unless Taves himself goes to the team and says, I have no interest. I have no interest in being a part of this process. Unless that happens, And while he said a couple years ago he didn't want to be part of a rebuild, maybe that's changed now. Maybe his opinion will have changed now. So Chicago's going to be an interesting one to watch. And then outside of that, again, I think it's a matter of Ottawa may sell off parts. They don't have anybody there that's really going to be an earth-shaking big mover. I don't think that in July we're going to look back at this year's trade deadline and say, wow, Florida won the cup because of what they did at the deadline. You know what got the Rangers the cup? They picked up Claude Giroux. Hell froze over. Giroux's a Ranger. It happens. Like, I just don't see it. And again, I say this with the caveat that Tampa Bay did it. It worked for them. It could happen. But I'd be interested to know from people watching this, if you got through all this, hey, kudos. And secondly, with the names that are available, and I've been through them, we've been through them, you've seen them all over the internet, who do you think ends up being a difference maker for one of the teams here? So, again, with the Giroux thing, right? Or Hampus Lindholm. If Hampus Lindholm is moved by the Ducks at the deadline, where do you think he could go to make the biggest difference? Would it be a huge difference maker for the Rangers? Could it be a move made by Carolina where they'd have to move somebody back to Anaheim? And it'd have to be a hockey trade for that to work. But could he be a pickup for Carolina that puts them over the top? Or could it be a move by Colorado, Florida? Or does a team like Nashville at the deadline make a move that ends up putting them over the top? Because while this is your top 10 in the standings, you also have some teams in here that could make noise in the playoffs. The Kings have the experience. The Caps have a Stanley Cup from 2018. Minnesota has Kaprizov. They have a lot of good parts to that team. It's not turning out very well right now, but they do have some very good pieces on that team. Nashville has the 2017 run. They do play better as underdogs. The Oilers, you have some guy named McDavid and another guy named Draisaitl. Eventually the Oilers have to go on a run. They just have to. And it may not be a Stanley Cup final, but they have to go on some kind of a run here to at least a conference final, you would think. And then there's Vegas. Vegas is always about the next piece. I mentioned this when they picked up Eichel, that is the latest instance where this team's found that next piece that they think will win them a Stanley Cup. And is there another next piece? Do they look at Hampus Lindholm and say, you know what, Martinez is out. We don't know when he's coming back. We're going to go get Lindholm. We'll move money out, bring money in. We'll figure this out. And then after the deadline, it's just a nightmare trying to keep the team under the cap. So it is going to be interesting to see what is done at the deadline, because a lot can change between now and next Monday. But you can understand why there's some gridlock when it comes to moves. And you can also understand why, if you're a fan of a team that's in this first column here, you have a good reason to think your team could go on a nice long run and maybe win a championship. Because there is parity at the top. It's just there's a number of teams that are at the tippy top here, and then there are some teams that are way down at the bottom. The separation between the top and the bottom does feel greater than in previous seasons. It has tightened up lately, though. So let me know your thoughts. Where do you think the big names go? And do you think that the deadline ends up being slower? Does it speed up? Do we get 20 deals on deadline day? Do we get 30? And are they all like this third-round pick for those 2 fourth-round picks? This AHL player you haven't heard of for this AHL player you also haven't heard of? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. As always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And hey, thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.